Up next on the Parth and Pratham show.
Um, Follow your curiosity. I think like when there is a thing that you're curious about in the world, learning more about it and learning what questions you still have about it is inevitably going to lead to some kind of story. There's not a single piece that I've ever written that didn't start with me being like, like I didn't know that there were these giant swamp rats in California. Like, what's that about? Or like, I had no idea that bull riders make less money than the bulls that they're riding in a rodeo. Like, that's kind of wild. Like, maybe there's something in that. I think it always starts with a question, and keeping lists of questions that you have about the world is my, like, I think, only concrete tip for how to find stories.
It's a Parth and Pratham show.
So, Parth, journalism and media bias has been in the news lately because of the upcoming election and the BLM protests. How did this American tradition of free press start?
That's a really good question. Journalism has been an important part of America ever since its inception. Journalism and the freedom of speech and the freedom of writing has been guaranteed since the First Amendment, which is the freedom of speech and the freedom of press. Previously, journalism has been characterized by print media, such as newspapers, which are long, in-depth journalism pieces. But now, journalism is created and spread in unconventional places like social media, such as Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit.
That's right, Parth. Speaking of social media, in this age of social media, information can be spread anywhere. And websites like Twitter and Reddit are really helping the spread that reach a massive audience. But social media has a role in our society. The only difficulty of using it is it's hard to differentiate between when it's real news and when it's news that's created intentionally to be false.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. But you can't rule social media out as an invalid news source. Social media is used to hold people accountable and share information in really, really fast ways, as shown in the BLM movement. The video of the murder of George Floyd, was first spread through social media before news outlets broke the story.
This relates perfectly to our first guest today. Here to talk about journalism and its transition to digital spaces, please welcome Francesca Fenzi, a professor at UC Berkeley and an education teacher at YR Media, as formerly Youth Radio. Francesca,
Yay.
Thank you for joining us.
Yay!
All right, let's end this. So, tell us about yourself. Do you have any favorite hobbies or things you like to do for fun?
Yes, let's see. Hobbies. I feel like those have probably shrunk a little bit in the current times. But I have gotten really into gardening. So I have a bunch of plants that I like to take care of. I make some like baked goods and things like that. And I'd say my hobbies are writing. Probably I do a little bit of creative writing and kind of like painting stuff when I have time.
What do you take your inspiration of painting off of? Do you just think it's like a fun thing to do?
Hmm. Um, I guess maybe it's somewhat related to the plants hobby, but I grew up in the Southwest in Arizona, where there it it's a landscape that doesn't look like there's a lot of color to it, because it's the desert, so a lot of things just kind of look dry and brown. But in the springtime or in the summer when we have monsoon season and there's a little bit of like rain that comes, everything just looks so bright and so alive. And so I got into painting because I wanted to start trying to capture some of the colors of how the cactus look when they're really bright and colorful. More like the idea of it than the way they look in pictures, because they never turned out right in pictures. So I guess that's probably where I draw my inspiration for drawing or painting is things in nature that I want to capture, like kind of the feeling more than the way it actually looks.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and you are a journalist. So, where did this love of journalism and basically like bringing back your past start? And also, where did you go for college?
Okay, let me see if I can answer all of this. Well, I'll start with the easiest one first. I went to college at a university called Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, um, which is kind of known for its engineering, but they have an arts program, which is what I studied. Um, as far as bringing like things from my past into my current work as either a journalist or an artist, I think um, I don't know. I think I've always really enjoyed telling stories, whether they're like visual or that's kind of how I wound up in art school. I knew I wanted to tell stories or carry something about like what I was observing in the world into the work that I was making. And at first I thought that I wanted to, I don't know, yeah, make paintings or sculptures or write fiction or something. And once I got to college and I started talking to more people and learning about the stories that were true for them and like the experiences that they'd had in their lives, that's when I started realizing that I really enjoyed journalism. Being able to kind of like take somebody's story and uh, share it with a broader audience of people, like hopefully sharing experiences with readers who might not like otherwise have thought about something that another person lived through.
Yeah, so the story of humans, that's something I like to write about too. Would you say that's your favorite topic to cover, or do you have maybe another broad topic that's your favorite to write on?
I think writing stories about humans is a great way to put my favorite topic. I worked as a science reporter for a while, or I like did science and environment stories because I like thought that I liked covering nature. And then I realized that I actually don't care that much about the nature. It's about how humans interact with the world around us. And so I think like yeah, telling human stories is definitely like the broadest but the most interesting beat.
Do you have a favorite story that you've covered of a human, as in, yeah, just maybe the most feel good story?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a feel good story, but this one always makes me smile or like I don't know how I feel. It's like a little bit sad, it's a little bit like cute. And I think that those are the stories that I like the best, the ones that have like complexity to them. But it seemed like a silly story when I pitched it. I did a audio story where there are these animals called nutria. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're like really large water rodents. So they're like swamp rats. Like literally, they're like the size of a Jack Russell Terrier. They're kind of like dog sized rats that are just super destructive. They eat like tons of grass and wetlands and stuff, and they populate really quickly. So they can be like very invasive. And I followed a guy around. I wanted to tell a story of like this kind of invasion happening in the Central Valley because there's actually a bunch of them in the Central Valley in California. So I followed this fish and wildlife guy around for like a whole day with like waiters, and we were like just like wading through all of these ponds while he was checking his traps. And he was just like very fun and a great character. But then it was like a little bit it started out as what I thought was going to be kind of a funny story about these strange rodents and this one guy who's like holding them off. And it turned into kind of a sadder story where he just was like, it was like this one man versus this like army that's like not going anywhere. You know, he couldn't catch any of them. We were checking trap after trap. And it was like they would like eat his food, his
Bait.
like the little sweet potatoes and stuff he was leaving out. And then they would like disappear. And so, I don't know why, but that story always like kind of hangs with me. I just think about his name is Jim. I think about Jim and his empty rodent traps, and I really hope he got something at some point.
Is that the strangest assignment or like piece you've ever had to write, or is there one that's stranger?
There's probably there are definitely stranger ones. I lived in Alaska for a little bit, so some of the stories that I covered up there were kind of wild. Like once a beached like a walrus like had died and like washed up on the beach, and people thought initially that it was a like a capsized boat, and so there was like a whole rescue effort like launched to try and try and like make sure that people hadn't fallen out of this boat. And we were it was a small town, so like whenever there was kind of like a police response, like the reporters would also get a call. And so we went out there, and it turned out obviously that it was not a boat, it was a walrus. And I remember thinking, man, this is like only in Alaska, like where else would this happen? Like accidental walrus misunderstanding. Yeah.
So how would you characterize the relationship between journalists? Do you feel it's like a competitive environment, like where always are trying to get the better story or the beat, or is it more they're trying to just work together to report facts?
That's a great question. I feel like I've worked in environments that were both ways. I think that it was a stereotype when I was in school or first learning journalism or like how to be a journalist that there was a little bit of that competitive spirit, especially when you're thinking about investigative journalism, right? Like somebody like the Watergate scandal and the reporters who broke that story. There's like a lot of like cloak and dagger and kind of like competition to get the story. And so I think there are still people who bring that approach to their work in the field, but I've always gravitated towards like reporting communities or um, like types of. I think actually like the type of medium you work in a little bit makes a difference too. Like radio people, I found to be rather collaborative generally. Um, and by comparison, like TV news people who have a much faster deadline and more pressure to kind of respond to audience uh, clicks and viewership. I think like that industry can be like a little bit more competitive. um, but I think it's just like any workplace. You find the people whose work style like resonates with you, and so I think I've always kind of gravitated towards more like collaborative work environments. I love working with videographers as well as like writers and people who are comfortable coding, because then you can make really cool stories and it's not a competition. It's about how you can all like bring your specialty to the story.
So you talked about how like each different medium of communication has a different standard, different pace. In your opinion, which is your favorite one? Do you like documentaries, flyers, audio, like podcast bits, or like interviews or things like that? Like which one is the best, I think it's like the easiest one to work in, I think.
I feel like I'm going to get in trouble because they're all great, but I totally do have favorites. Um, I think that the type of people I like to work with best and the types of stories I've enjoyed working on most are usually like more of a long form story where there's less of that deadline pressure and it's more about going really in depth. So like documentary film, I love magazine writing. Anytime you're doing like a long written feature, um, I think that like people who like to make those kinds of stories are also the kinds of people who don't feel quite as like cutthroat about um, like getting the inside scoop. Not that there's anything wrong with either one. I think the field needs both to be successful. Like we need people who are breaking news and kind of on the cutting edge of like uh, holding people in power accountable. But I personally like the kinds of stories where you sit with a character and a story for a little bit longer, and it's a little bit less about um, maybe catching the bad guys and more about like what can we learn about the human experience from this one person's story. And sometimes that also involves catching the bad guys. I don't know.
So just so our audience knows, how long have you served as like a working journalist, or at least been in the industry?
Let's see. I probably started. Well, I got my first job writing for a magazine right after I graduated college, which was in 2012. And then I've taken time because I'm a teacher as well. I've taken time to do things that were like a little bit more focused on the teaching end of things. So I would say probably like somewhere in the like 6 or 7 year range. Um, yeah, with like some breaks.
So that's a pretty decent amount of time. Would you have any tips maybe to offer for how you're able to find these hidden stories? Because you survived for such a long time.
Yeah, you make it sound like it's like a life raft we all have to stay on, which like maybe it is. Tips for story pitching. Man, that's always one of the hardest topics because I feel like it was the hardest one for me. I always had questions about it when I was learning, like where do you find your stories? And it's still one of the hardest ones that I like try to find recommendations for because it's kind of hard to find like concrete tips. I think this is going to come off as sounding cheesy, but I think it's truly the most like fundamentally true. Um, that was, you know what I'm saying. Follow your curiosity. I think like when there is a thing that you're curious about in the world, learning more about it and learning what questions you still have about it is inevitably going to lead to some kind of story. there's not a single piece that I've ever written that didn't start with me being like, like I didn't know that there were these giant swamp rats in California. Like, what's that about? Or like, I had no idea that bull riders make less money than the bulls that they're riding in a rodeo. Like, that's kind of wild. Like, maybe there's something in that. I think it always starts with a question, and keeping lists of questions that you have about the world is my, like, I think, only concrete tip for how to find stories.
Yeah. So pivoting topics entirely, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced a lot of people to work at home. Do you think journalism will change in any way as a result of this pandemic?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing it change. I have a friend who's a reporter in West Texas, which is a like really rural place, and he spends a lot of his job usually driving around to different places in his coverage area and trying to kind of like, I think, do some reporting the good old fashioned way, knocking on doors, talking to people, going to like social events and trying to like just get what word on the street is. And a lot of those things aren't happening now because of COVID-19. So we're seeing this shift of the way that people are reporting into more of these kind of online environments, which I think work well for certain kinds of stories, but make it a little bit more difficult for like local or community reporting, which is usually the foundation of how we wind up with some of these national stories, right? Like somewhat along the line, a local news reporter um, found something that was interesting and important to them and did some groundwork reporting, and then usually that story kind of gains momentum, and that's how it winds up on our national news. Um, so I don't know what that means exactly for our future news environment, but I think that this is making it harder for local news sites and like reporters to survive, and also like that will probably have some kind of trickle effect for the rest of the industry.
So it's really important to stress that journalists and just news media is really important in society. They have a role of keeping people accountable and making sure that things are not gone unnoticed, right? But what do you think is the role that journalists have in society, and what's the worst thing that can happen if they don't do their jobs well and do some like misinformation or misreporting?
Oh yeah, what a great question. I mean, I think that sometimes we hear there's this separation between like journalists and quote unquote the media. I feel like everybody in my life, whether they mean to or not, like even my family members will say things like, "Oh, well, the media tells us blah," and I'm always like, the media is like an entity that's just made up by a bunch of people like me who are telling. Like none of us are like sitting around a table being like, "Here's the conspiracy that we're trying to feed to the American public." It's like the problems arise when we do or don't do our job like well. And I guess what that looks like to me, because I think that was like the second part of your question, is I think that the pressure of fast deadlines and low funding sometimes create um, opportunities for laziness in reporting. And I think that's always the kinds of story that ends up being the most damaging, right? Because like if I go to cover, actually this happened to me early in my career. I went to cover a event where the police officers in a community that had a like high rate of violence, both like in the community and then like police violence as well. They were doing a like, one of these kind of like have coffee, get to know your local cops kind of thing. Um, as a new reporter in the community with less like understanding of some of the dynamics at play, I went, I talked to some cops. I was like, these guys are so nice. This cute little coffee event, so great. Like, wrote it up just as like a surface level like story of the event. Um, I had a deadline that I needed to meet where I had to get it done that day, and I didn't know that much about the context, right? So like what ended up getting published was like, here's this event, blah blah blah, nothing like deeper to like really gain from it. And I think it's like pressures that lead to some problematic storytelling, right? Because whether I knew it or not at the time, by reporting this piece about like that was ultimately like a very flattering thing for the police department without taking into account some of the like history behind like why they were doing it, or why community members might not feel like very trusting of the police in their like neighborhood, um or even being critical of the idea that like those events were the right way to approach like repairing relationships. um in a way, I kind of like left information out for the public, right? And I think that that's what happens more often than not. It's not that like people are sitting around intentionally saying like, let's tell this fake narrative to the public. It's more like ignorance and like pressure from their bosses and kind of like laziness sometimes. And I like all of us are guilty of that occasionally.
So you talked about how journalists are sometimes like underpaid or overworked, right? And so this goes into our next question. Do you think journalists, like just the everyday journalists, not like the people on like TV shows or TV channels or whatever, just the everyday journalist who writes for a local paper, do you think they're undervalued by their bosses or by society?
Hmm. I I don't know. I think that they're undervalued in the same way that I think like teachers can be undervalued, where I think everyone agrees that education is important, and yet the like salaries that we pay teachers make it difficult to live for people who want to make that their like career, right? And I think somewhat similarly, I think people understand, or I like to believe that most of the public understands why journalism is important, even if they don't always agree with like what a certain news outlet is reporting. Um, but the dynamics of the industry, right? Like lots of like freelance contracts instead of full time jobs with benefits, or um, jobs that don't pay very well or require you to work in a newsroom without a lot of support, like to be a staff reporter on a small local like news stations, like somewhere like Texas. Um, you might be the only person in your newsroom because that's all they can afford. Like those kinds of things, those kinds of pressures are, I think, what make it difficult to survive. It's like not that people don't think the work is valuable enough, but that we don't do a good job of paying for work that's valuable.
That's a really good analogy to compare them to teachers. Um, so going a little bit towards education, we've seen a lot of like journalism now happening on social media where everyone can be a reporter. So what would you say to like critics who say a journalism degree is not needed anymore because everyone can report a story without a degree?
I actually totally agree with that. I don't think you need a journalism degree to be a reporter, but I think that uh you know, to borrow a little bit from Spider-Man, it's like with great power comes great responsibility. I think that like that's the main thing that having a degree or having like a training, a formal kind of training has lent to me, is a sense of that responsibility for what happens when I don't do my job well, or when I'm kind of like flailing around and learning like what the consequences are. And I think that that's really the only thing that anybody needs to be a successful journalist is a desire to tell stories and a sense of responsibility to tell them well. You don't need to go to college to do that, but I do think that not everybody with a camera phone like takes that same responsibility seriously.
Do you see any benefit in having credentialed journalists over normal people? So you said anyone can tell it, but do you think maybe credentialed journalists will tell them well, or is it maybe the same level?
Hmm. You know, I don't know that I think that that would make a huge difference. I think that having, because I think a little, this is kind of the thing, right? Like this is the issue with fake news, is I think sometimes there's this narrative that I've heard within journalism itself. There's like this kind of like elitist approach where it's like, oh, the public doesn't know better, so we have to inform them. We have to make it like really clear that we're the authority on this topic, blah, blah, blah. And I think that that's a mistake, because we live in a time period where people have access to information in a way that is completely unprecedented in all of human history. Like anybody can do their own research on the internet and like find information that would have taken like years and lots of like specialized like digging in the past. So our audiences are smarter than they've ever been. I think the difficulty comes with like our confirmation biases, right? Because I, just like everyone else, think that I'm capable of fact checking and like sussing out what is or isn't true when somebody else is telling it to me. And I think that having credentialed journalists, you'd have to somehow find a way for everyone to agree on like what makes a good journalist, and that's just something that we've never really had in the field, right? Like for example, like comparing like Fox News to like NPR or the New York Times, like those are all reputable news organizations, but people have firm biases about whether or not one is like more or less aligned with certain political views, whether is more or less trustworthy. But all those journalists like are doing the same thing. They're just working for organizations that have like stereotypes associated with them. So I kind of think credentials would be difficult without having the stereotypes attached. I don't know if that
so
answered your
I
whole
want to stress
question.
on the stereotypes just one little bit. So you talked about how people are like always saying, "Oh, media bias." There's a media bias, and there obviously is, right? Because right now in politics and in America, the nation is completely divided. Oftentimes, journalists are forced to like pick a side on like, do I want to go for ratings or do I want to go for advertisers or like viewers? You know what I mean? And you have to like shift your story in order to get publicity or get some fame. How would you recommend staying objective? And is staying objective important?
Mm. I think that's the current great debate in journalism in general is like, is objectivity possible and is it actually desirable? I think I come down on the side that feeling like it's not possible to be completely objective, and that by ignoring our biases, that's kind of how we wind up with like almost entirely white newsrooms, right? That have like a certain style or like a certain angle that they approach most stories from because they don't have a diversity of experience or a diversity of like perspectives telling them that maybe there's another side to the story. Um, so I think that our bias is impossible to remove, and it's more our responsibility to acknowledge and be transparent about what our bias is. If that makes sense. Like I think instead of pretending that we can be like an objective third party, it's more useful to say like, hey, I'm a human being and I've gathered this information and I'm laying out all of this information for you, the audience. Take what you know about me and what I'm sharing about my process and make an informed decision about what it is that I'm telling you. I think that that's, I don't know, maybe that's where like the teacher in me kind of comes out a little bit too. But I think that's the approach that um, makes more sense when we're dealing with an audience that's as educated and capable as like being informed as we live in right now.
So you just talked about teaching. So you choose to work with teenagers and college students for a living. So you encounter the young journalists a lot. What is if they only take away one thing from you, what is something you like them to remember?
Oh man. Oh gosh, you're putting me on the spot. I feel like I usually get like weeks and weeks to tell them all the things that I want them to know. um,
Biggest impact.
the biggest impact.
Is there some sort of like mantra or something that you hold dear to your heart that like, I don't know, it's like in times where you're like questioning something, it's like, oh, this is what I have to hold on to and this is what, maybe it's something you can pass down like that?
Yeah, I don't know if this is, I mean, I feel like I have a couple, but this is what I'm thinking about based on what we've just been talking about. I think that the thing I notice most in working with young journalists, whether they're teenagers or whether they're like young adults, like in high school or in college, I think that there's a big fear that they won't tell an interesting or important story or the right way. There's like this like kind of imposter syndrome that like they don't know like whether their voice has a place in the industry. And I think that like the only thing, or like the biggest thing that I try to like infuse into all of my teaching is that you your voice is your voice. Nobody else like has that. You might be the one person whose like voice adds a perspective to the conversation that totally changes the tone of the way that like we think about it as a society. I don't think it's ever I don't think there's ever like let me back up. When I was learning storytelling, both like fiction and journalism when I was younger, I think there was a lot of emphasis on being quote unquote original, finding like an original story or a way to tell something. And I think that that's the wrong message because all of us are original. It's more like finding a way to make your voice add something to what the rest of like our society is talking about. And I think that if I could tell young journalists anything, it would be don't be afraid to start learning. Don't be afraid to practice your voice and practice inserting it into those conversations.
So it's like find your own voice and then not necessarily capitalize on it, but make sure that it's you're sharing your truth. Is that like a good way
Exactly.
to sum it up?
Yeah, I think so. As journalists, as journalists, we are always pursuing truth, both in the facts that we're reporting and I think like identifying what our truth is in the way that we're telling them. And that's where that kind of bias versus objectivity comes back.
Yeah.
I think it's like you have to be true to yourself and to your own perspective and just be like trust enough that an audience can like see when you're just like when you're having a conversation and you're doing things with kind of like good intentions. I think if you bring that transparency to your work, it makes all of us better.
So you have been part of many podcasts. I was looking at like podcasts and radio shows, right, on your website. And
Uh-huh.
so uh during the COVID-19 crisis, me, a lot of my friends, and I just think a lot of people have just looked to podcasts in order to like talk with their friends or share information, right? And so as an experienced podcaster slash radio personality, what are some tips you can give to people who are starting out their podcast and just pursuing journalism in a more audio sense?
I love audio. I think that it's one of the best mediums for um I guess these kinds of conversations, right? Where you're gaining a little bit of a new like perspective on something. Human conversation, like I think audio is just like a great way to capture human conversation. And one of the things I like best about podcasts is that whether you're making them or listening to them, it often feels like you're just kind of a fly on the wall with like some really smart friends and having a great talk. And that's kind of what I've always loved about it. So I guess for people who are, I'm thrilled that more people are like getting into podcasting and that it's having this boom because I think it's a great medium. Um, Tips for making it. I think kind of the same advice that I have about finding your voice. It's like start playing with it. Just like start experimenting and see what works well for you, what kinds of formats you like. There's so many different things. There's like what we're doing right now where we're all just in a room talking with one another. And then on the far end of the spectrum, they're like fully scripted like radio dramas, just like the 1950s like radio shows. There's this Wolverine show on Stitcher that like it's like a television program but like for your ears. And so you can do so much stuff with it. You just have to kind of find I think like play around and find what feels like the fun thing for you to make.
I have the
Awesome.
same feelings about the podcast where you're like being a fly on the wall and you're not distracted by anything. Like I'm a huge fan of interviews, but then you take a look on it on television and then the flow has to get interrupted by commercials or maybe you're just focused on more of the presentation. But podcast is all audio and like all content.
And I think what I like about it is that it involves our imagination in the same way that reading does. I think that there is something incredibly empathy building about not actually being able to see the other person who's talking and instead having to base everything that you know or understand about them on their voice and the like nonverbal like emotional cues that they're giving. I think it makes it easier to identify with people. Sometimes like when we see somebody we like get an idea of who they are or what they're like, and when we strip that away their story feels more like one that you're like, oh, like I as another human can like kind of get where they're coming from with this.
Well, thank you for coming on our show today. If viewers want to learn more about you, where can they contact you?
I guess they could contact me, I think through my website. I think I have a link to my email there, francescafenzi.com. You all did great research. I am flattered that you went and looked at my website. Yeah, I think that might be the best recommendation. Thank you for having me. It's been really nice to talk to you both.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it was a great show, and I had a great time.
Me too. We learned a lot.